Hi guys. So we've been talking about how to notate diatonic triads with Roman numerals. And in last week's example, I introduced the idea of a simple chord progression, which is how do we put different diatonic progressions in sequence to create combinations. So in this week's example, I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated chord progression, and I'm also going to show you how that chord progression is notated with Roman numeral notation. And I'm going to introduce another idea, which is the idea of what's called voice leading. So let's talk about that first. So you saw last week's example how I had kept the chord progression in a root triad root position, and I've actually written this progression up here in root position in at the bottom to show you guys that when we write chord progressions in first and in root position triads, we end up with a lot of like big jumps. So in this case, for example, from D major to A major, we have to move every single one of these notes up by a fifth. So that's a pretty big jump. And every time that we have a new chord, we have to make jumps and we have to move every single note. But the way that chords are written more often in music is by trying to use a combination of the triads inversions and what's called voicings or reorderings of the triad to keep voices from moving or jumping too much, and also to take advantage of any common notes that we might have between chords. Like for example, D major, the third note of the triad is A, but then in A major, the first note of the triad or the root is also A, so we have a common note. And we can take advantage of this to create different what are called chord voicings to keep things a little bit smoother from jumping too much. And also just to change the sound of the chords, because the triads, when you just play them like this in root position, they sound very similar, and it doesn't really sound very interesting. So let's talk about the example at the top. But before I go through it chord by chord, I just want to play it so that you hear what they sound. And this system up here, this grand staff, is exactly the same chord progression as the bottom grand staff. This is just using different voicings and using voice leading to change what the chord sounds like. And at the bottom, they're just in root position. They're just closed triads. So let's listen to hear what they sound like. And this triad in root position version. Okay, so you see very different sound, even though it's the exact same chord structure. It's exactly the same chords. It's just that we've reordered the triads here to create different voicings to make it sound different. So let's talk about exactly what those voicings were and like what kind of changes I've made. So the first chord is the first degree of the scale, or tonic, and is in root position because the D, the first note of the triad, is at the bottom, it's the bass note. But instead of putting F sharp, which is the second note of the triad, instead of putting F sharp next, I've actually moved it to the top of the chord. It's actually on the treble or the soprano line. Sometimes in this kind of like fourth part chord, like fourth part polyphony, which is called, we actually label the voices by bass line, tenor line, alto line, and soprano line. So you might hear that sometimes. So I've actually moved that F sharp to the soprano line, to the top line. And then the A is here in the tenor line. And the alto line has a D, which is a doubling of this D an octave higher. So you see this voicing is actually bigger than an octave because we have our first octave from this D to this D, and then we have an F sharp on top of that. So you see how that we took this triad in closed form and we created an open voicing of the same chord. All right, let's move on to the next chord. So the next chord is A major, or the dominant in terms of scale degrees, the 5th scale degree. But I've taken the second note of the triad, C sharp, and put it in the bass line this time. So we went from D just down a half step or down a minor second to C sharp. So you see that's a very small jump. It's just a half step. And then I went ahead and took advantage of the common tone of between these two chords, which is an A natural. And I kept that A, since I already had it on the tenor line, I kept it on the tenor line so that we didn't have to move that line. And then I went on the alto line, I went from D to E. So E is the third note of the triad, but we've put it in the alto line. And then so this one also moved up by a second. So instead of so this one moved up, this one moved down by a second, but this one went up by a second. This one didn't move, it's just the unison. And then this soprano line moved up by a third, from F natural to A natural. So A here is the first note of the triad and it's doubled. We have our first A here and our second A here. So the range of this chord is also bigger than an octave. So this is also an open voicing. And I just want to mention, because the second note of the triad is at the bottom, this is also a first inversion. And we've labeled that with the superscript 6 to the right of the Roman numeral. So our next chord is the B minor triad, which is the 6th degree, the 6th diatonic triad of D major. It's a minor triad. If you remember, in major scales, the 6th degree triad is going to be a minor triad. And so that's why it's labeled as a lowercase Roman numeral for number 6. And so let's see what I've done here. So in the triad, we have B, D, F sharp. And here we have the bass line B natural. So it's in root position because the first note of the triad is in the bass line. And I just moved down a second from the previous note. So that's a pretty small jump. And our next note is actually the third note of the triad. It's the F sharp. So that's the next note that we have. And we've gone down on the tenor line from this A down a third to F sharp. So it's still a pretty small jump. Next note is a D in the alto line, which the D is going to be our second note of the triad. And we've moved down by a second on the alto line. And then finally, the last note is B natural, which is a doubling of the bass line. And this is actually 2 octaves apart. So this chord has a range of 2 octaves. Our second octave would be here. This would be the next B, would have been here. And in this case, the soprano line went up a second from A to B. So you see, these voicings are made so that we have small jumps, and also so that we can move in different directions. Before in the triads, you notice that every single note moved in the same direction. Here they all moved up, here they all moved up, and here they all moved down. But in this case, we can actually have opposite motion. We can have some notes go up, and here we can have some notes go down. These go down, this go down, but this one goes up. So just, that's another way, that's another thing to think about. Okay, the next triad is G major, which is the 4th or the subdominant of D major. And note that these two triads have two tones in common. We have B natural and D natural in common in these two triads. So I've actually went ahead and took advantage of that, and I kept the D that was in the alto line, and I kept it in the alto line so that we didn't have to move. So we have a unison here. It just didn't go anywhere. And so that's one of the first common tone. And then the second common tone was the B, and we had it in the bass line, and then I kept it in the bass line. And then the other notes of the triad are here. And here we went up in the tenor line, we went up by a second. And in the soprano line, we went down by a third. And because we didn't have the root of G major at the bottom, we have B, which is the second note of the triad. Because we have it at the bottom on the bass note, this is a first inversion, and we notate that with the superscript 6. Okay, next chord is D major again, which is the tonic, but note that this voicing is different than this. Here we have the third note of the triad, which is A. We have that at the bottom, and because this is the bass note, this is the lowest note of all, this is going to be a second inversion notated with the 6/4 superscript over here. So that's second inversion because we have the third note of the triad at the bottom. And we have D, which is here, and then we have our A, and then F sharp is over here. And also, so we've made a move of a second down in the bass, a second down on the tenor. We kept the common D, which, if you haven't noticed, there was a common note. This D here and this D is a common tone, so we kept it in the alto line. And then in opposite motion, we went up a second from G to A in the soprano line. And next chord is going to be an A7 chord, or in terms of diatonic chords, this is the fifth degree, or the dominant. And starting from the bass, we have A, which is the root, so this is going to be in root position. And we mark a root position 7 chord with the superscript 7. We kept the A in the same position in the bass line, so that we didn't have any motion. We took advantage of the common note, the common tone. The next note in the tenor line is going to be G, and the G is actually the seventh of that, of the seventh chord, or the fourth note of the chord. So we put that in the tenor, and we went up a second to get it in the tenor line. The next note is C, which is the second note of the seventh chord. And we went in to get it in the alto line, we went down by a second from D to C, C sharp specifically. And then the soprano line stayed in A, so we took advantage of the common tone. So we stayed in A. And then finally this 5/7 chord, or this dominant 7 chord, resolves to the tonic. We have a final tonic here. And this one's a little bit different than the first tonic. As you can see, here I actually have the second note of the triad here. Whereas, so that's F sharp. And in this example, I actually had it up here. And the A went from being in the tenor line to being in the soprano line. So you see, it's a different voicing. And one of the reasons why I did that is because one of the ways that a dominant 7 chord is commonly resolved is you take the leading tone, which is in this case C sharp. Remember this, the leading tone is the seventh, the raised 7th degree that resolves by half step to the tonic. So C sharp moves up to D. So the leading tone usually moves up by half step to the tonic, And the seventh, which in this chord is here, G natural, the seventh usually resolves down to the third scale degree, which is F sharp. So we go from G, F sharp. So this is like a way that dominant 7 usually resolves. So anyway, this is just an introduction to simple chord progressions and voice leading. This is just the beginning of this idea. But this is as far as we're going to go for these lessons in chord progressions. But I encourage you guys to keep studying this on your own. And there's a lot of resources out there online to take this further. All right. See you guys later.